I've been playing Pokemon for about 20 years now. Pokemon Red was my first Pokemon game, it was my first RPG, my first handheld game, and one of my first video games in general. And over 20 years later since Pokemon's inception, we are now on the 8th generation. That is insane to think about, especially if you've been playing since the very beginning. And today, I'm going to rank all the main games from each generation from my least favorite to favorite. Now keep in mind, I'm only just doing main games, I'm not doing remakes like Heart Gold, Soul Silver, or Mega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire. But with that being said, let's get into the list. Coming in at number 8, we have Generation 7, aka Pokemon Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon. Now, even though Generation 7 is my personal least favorite generation, I actually do think it's a really good gen. And I praise Game Freak a lot for changing up the Pokemon formula. Rather than having 8 gyms, and Elite Four, then Champion, and you still had the Elite Four and the Champion, but instead of gyms, you had the Island Challenges, you had the Totem Pokemon, and these were really cool concepts. I would love to see Game Freak implement something like them in future Pokemon games. These were nice new challenges for players, and speaking of challenge, I thought the difficulty was really good as well. The difficulty definitely stepped up, especially compared to something like Generation 6 X and Y. There were times where I was almost in trouble, I almost needed to grind, and that's really refreshing to see a Pokemon present some sort of a challenge. And the story is hands down one of the best in the series. You had so many memorable characters like Gladion, Lusamine, and of course, your boy, Guzma. Now with that being said, why is this my least favorite generation? It's my least favorite because of all the cutscenes and hand-holding the game has, especially in the beginning. Now there aren't nearly as many cutscenes in these games compared to a typical JRPG like Final Fantasy, and the amount of dialogue is roughly on par with something like Black and White, but because of the way the 3DS worked with all the camera angles, it really dragged out all the cutscenes. It made them feel long and just drawn out and just really boring, especially in the beginning like I said. And this kills the replay value for me because whenever I want to replay it, I think to myself, man, I don't want to go through that tutorial again. The tutorial on how to catch Pokemon just felt really dragged out. And also, I didn't really like Z moves that much. Z moves were kind of meh to me. The Ultra Beasts were really cool. Again, that's another concept I would like to see implemented in future games. Really, I wish Game Freak would just expand on the Ultra Beasts. Because really, that's a cool concept. Pokemon from a different dimension, that's awesome. Now, with all that said, Generation 7 is still a good generation, but for me, it's my least favorite. Coming in at number 7, we have the very first generation, Generation 1, yes, Generation 1, where it all started, where this journey began. And believe me, it actually hurts me to put Generation 1 in this low spot. It's the generation I grew up with. I have very fond memories of my childhood with this game, and this was part of a lot of people's childhoods. I remember just playing this game, watching the anime, pretending to be Ash. It was just a really fun time. Squirtle was my first Pokemon. I still love Squirtle. I love the whole Squirtle line. Blastoise is my favorite water-type Pokemon to this day, but we can't deny that Generation 1 is very archaic. It didn't age well, and you really can't blame Generation 1 for that because it is the first Pokemon game. Most first games are going to be rough around the edges, and Generation 1 had a lot of glitches, notably Missing Number, which to be honest, I actually think Missing Number was really cool. But it did introduce the formula, it introduced most things of the series, it introduced most of the type, it introduced how battles are played, the original 151 Pokemon that we all know and love, and the Kanto region, which to be honest, looking back, the Kanto region isn't anything special. I still like the Kanto region, again, it still holds a place in my heart, but overall it's not really impressive compared to other regions later on. But despite its faults, despite its glitchiness and bugs, Generation 1 is still a good generation. You could still replay it and still have a fun time with it, and it holds a very special place in my heart, but unfortunately I like the other generations a little better, so it gets the number 7 spot. Coming in at number 6, we actually move from Pokemon's humble beginnings to the present day with Generation 8, Pokemon Sword and Shield. And man, did these games receive a lot of hate pre-release. And to be honest, a lot of that hate is justified. We had the infamous Dexit where they pretty much wiped half of the Pokemon from these games. We also saw a lot of the textures in some of the trailers, and yeah, those textures did not look that good at all. However, upon release and playing the game, I have to say this generation is pretty good. The Pokemon in this generation were a little more memorable to me than in Sun and Moon. Hop and Beat are now two of my favorite characters in the entire series, and we went back to having gym leaders. And now what I really like about the gym leaders in these games is that they're actually more involved in the story than most other games. Most other games, the gym leaders, you beat them, you get the badge, and you move on. That's their whole role. That's the only part they play in the story. But these gym leaders, you felt something towards them, you felt a connection with them. The gym leaders in this game are some of the most memorable ones in the series. The story was okay for what it is. Probably my biggest gripe with the story is is that the protagonist a lot of times didn't feel like the protagonist. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times an event would go down and the protagonist would try and help out. They would basically say, oh no, you just gotta go get badges, you don't worry about it, leave it to the adults. And that really frustrated me because that happened quite a bit. And Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing, they were really cool. However, I did not like them nearly as much as Mega Evolutions, although I did like them way more than Z moves. And probably my biggest complaint about the generation is that Sword and Shield are very short. This was the fastest time I've ever beaten a Pokemon game. And it's not like I sped through the game. I actually took my time. I explored the region, got to know the Pokemon, bonded with my team, got most items that I could find. And even with all of that, I still found the game to be very short. However, the Pokemon themselves were a little more memorable to me than in Generation 7. And the Galar region is okay. It's actually not a bad region. It's a decently sized region. It just felt a little linear, probably even more linear than something like Unova. But is Sword and Shield as bad as the pre-release hate would suggest? Absolutely not even close. I think Sword and Shield are a good step in the right direction. I just wish it was a little longer, but hopefully Game Freak learns from this and keeps improving. I think Generation 8 is a pretty good generation. Coming in at number 2, we have Generation 2, Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal. I love Generation 2. It improved so much from Generation 1. It wasn't nearly as glitchy, it wasn't nearly as buggy. The story was a really big step up from Generation 1. Generation 1's story was really bare bones, but like I said, it's the first generation, so you can't really fault Game Freak for that. And Silver, in my opinion, is still the best rival we've ever had in a Pokemon game. And don't get me wrong, I still love Blue. Blue really was a good troll, but in terms of story and characters, Silver far outclasses him. It introduced a lot of awesome Pokemon. Some of my favorites include Quagsire, Typhlosion, and Ho-Oh, who's arguably my second favorite legendary of all time. And the Johto region, in my opinion, is a better region than Kanto. It was a lot more memorable, there was more to explore. And speaking of Kanto though, you actually got to go back after you beat Lance, the champion. You actually got to explore Kanto again. And of course, have arguably the most well-known battle in all of Pokemon, the battle on Mount Silver against Red. The first time I fought Red, I got destroyed. You have no idea how bad I got beaten. So what are some downsides of Generation 2? Honestly, looking at Generation 2, not a whole lot. One big downside though is obviously the most infamous difficulty spike, and that's the fight against Whitney. Whitney was a pain. No matter when you play the game, no matter which starter you choose, Whitney for the most part is going to be a pain. Her Miltank at that time is so overpowered. It can recover, it can use rollout. The fight in general was just real annoying. As a kid, I got stuck on that fight. Whitney made me cry. Like, I remember being a kid and just crying because I could not beat her. Eventually I did, but that was because I grinded a lot. But other than that difficulty spike, I really did not find a whole lot of problems with Generation 2. It's a little more archaic compared to the later generations, but not nearly as bad as Generation 1. So the reason why this generation is a little low is nothing really due to the generation itself, but mostly because the later generations improved a lot. Generation 2 though is awesome, and I highly recommend playing them. But if you don't want to play Gold and Silver, then definitely get your hands on Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Me personally, I actually never played those games. I know I really should, but from what I've heard, those games are absolutely stellar. I would definitely recommend picking those up. And like I said, Gen 2, really awesome generation. Kicking off the top half of this list, we have Generation 6, aka Pokemon X and Y. Just like how Sword and Shield got a lot of hate pre-release, X and Y got a lot of hate post-release. And while I do understand where some of that hate comes from, I really don't think this generation deserves nearly as much hate as it gets. A lot of that hate comes from the story, characters, and the XP share. The story was really bare bones, especially compared to games like Black and White and Sun and Moon. The characters weren't that memorable. The rivals in these games are by far the worst rivals in the series. I personally dislike How a lot, but at the very least, How is a memorable character. The rivals in X and Y, I don't care for them. I don't really remember them that much. And the XP share, now I like and dislike the XP share at the same time. I really like it because unlike other games where the XP share only hits one Pokemon, in this game the XP share is a key item, which by the way you could turn on and off if you want, and hits all the Pokemon. So it mitigates grinding a lot, and realistically, who likes grinding in video games? However, the big downside to this is that it makes the game way too easy. X and Y are by far the easiest Pokemon games. Yes, even even easier than Pokemon Sword and Shield. Because at least in that game, at 1 or 2 points, I felt like I was a little underleveled. In X and Y, I was never underleveled. I think I only lost one battle throughout my entire playthrough. And that's really a shame because I know Pokemon isn't the hardest game. It's not meant to be the hardest game. It's a kid's game. But it could present a little bit more challenge than what X and Y did. However, gameplay-wise, X and Y is really not bad. It's actually very good. The Kalos region is an awesome region. The battles felt really smooth. And that was one of the worries I had going to this game. I thought to myself, since they're 3D, the battles won't feel as streamlined and smooth as the 2D games. But no, the battles felt really smooth, very streamlined. And Mega Evolutions are awesome. Mega Evolutions, I like them a lot more than Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing, and definitely more than Z moves. And even though Generation 6 didn't introduce that many Pokemon, a lot of them really did stick out to me, such as Greninja, Talonflame, and Yveltal. And post-game, even though I'm not that big of a fan of Looker, I did think his quest was really nice. You got to be a detective. It was just a really nice post-game. And honestly, overall, Generation 6, Pokemon X and Y, they're really good games. I know they're easy. Like I said, they're the easiest games in the series by far, but that doesn't mean they're not fun to play. I think X and Y are really fun games. They don't deserve nearly as much hate as they get. And they were a fantastic way to kick off the 3D era. Coming in at number 3, we have Pokemon Generation 4, aka Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. Now, originally, I was actually going to put these games below X and Y. However, looking back and replaying both of them, I have to say that I like Generation 4 just slightly better than X and Y. For a few reasons. One reason is that it's much harder than X and Y. Generations 4 and 7 are the hardest generations in my opinion. Cynthia is still by far the hardest champion. And I didn't replay Generation 4 that long ago, and Cynthia still almost gave me some trouble. More trouble than any other champion. And Sinnoh is just an absolutely fun region to travel through. The only part of Sinnoh that I hated was that one part where you had to like go through snow, and the snow was so thick that your trainer just stopped at times. That part was kind of annoying, but overall Sinnoh was a really good region. And the story was pretty good too. The villain team though, Team Galactic, they were kind of dumb. Their reason to destroy the universe, it was just, I don't know, I did not agree with Team Galactic at all. However, trying to harness power from the Pokemon gods, that takes a lot of courage to do, so kudos to Cyrus. And Generation 4 also introduced something that may not seem that big of a deal to casual or newer players, but to competitive players and veterans of the series, this was a really big change, and that's the physical and special hit split. Because before Generation 4, moves were based on type, so all fire moves, for example, were special attacks. Now obviously something like Flamethrower is a special attack. Fire Punch, where you're physically hitting something, was considered a special move, and I thought Generation 4 really did a good job at making the difference between what's a physical and a special attack. And Barry, I love Barry so much. I don't like him as much as Silver, but I thought Barry was still a very competent rival. The Pokemon were extremely memorable. Gameplay felt a little slower compared to its predecessors, but not nearly as slow as something like Sun and Moon. And overall, if you want a Pokemon game that could potentially give you a challenge, Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum are definitely the games to get. Coming in at number 2, and in my opinion, what I think is objectively the best generation, Generation 5, Black and White and Black and White 2. Generation 5, like I said, is probably objectively the best Pokemon game. The story, incredible. Characters, you have N, Ghetsis, really amazing characters. Ghetsis is still by far my favorite villain boss. Team Plasma was a very awesome team. The Unova region, while very linear, was still an awesome region to go through, and the cities themselves made up for it. Almost every city I went through was just so memorable. In terms of difficulty, the game was definitely, I would say, one of the harder ones. Not as hard as Generations 4 or 7, but definitely harder than something like Generation 6 or Generation 8. And the music was absolutely stellar. All Pokemon games have really good music, but Generation 5's music was insanely good. The bike theme is in the running for my favorite Pokemon music of all time. And the Pokemon in Generation 5, before anyone starts saying, yes, I know we have an ice cream Pokemon in Generation 5, but the other Pokemon were so awesome and amazing to me. Whimsicott's my favorite grass type. Samurot's cool, even though Samurot's not really a competitive Pokemon. I thought Samurott was really cool. Female and Pheasant, even though the design is kind of bland, I think it's actually pretty cool. And Cinccino, I love Cinccino. Cinccino was so cute. I love him. I love Cinccino so much. In terms of rivals, I did not play Black and White 1, but I did play White 2, and he was okay. He wasn't bad. And the game was overall one of the lengthier games in my opinion, because there's so much to explore, so much to do. And the Pokemon World Tournament at the end was awesome. Probably my favorite post game of all time, because you got to fight every gym leader, every Elite Four, every champion from the previous games. Who doesn't like that? This generation is amazing, fantastic. In my opinion, it is objectively the best generation, but not quite my favorite. Very close second, but still just not my favorite. And at number 1, we have my favorite Pokemon generation of all time, Pokemon Sapphire, Ruby, and Emerald. Gameplay wise, Generation 3 had the biggest impact on Pokemon by far, especially in the competitive scene, because it introduced 2 mechanics that are still used to this day, abilities and natures. Abilities changed the course of battle extremely, as you had to think what Pokemon is going to have what ability and what moveset you should have to counter that Pokemon. Let's say you're going against a Weezing. Sure, Weezing is a poison type and is weak to ground, but you can't really use your Earthquake because its ability Levitate makes it immune to ground moves. It also introduced double battles, which double battles are really cool. It adds a new element of strategy to the game. The story was pretty good. It was refreshing to see a new Pokemon villain team. Team Aqua and Magma, while they're not my favorite teams, I still thought they were memorable. I like them a lot more than Team Rocket, although Team Rocket will always hold a special place in my heart. And the Hoenn region, my favorite region of all time. To me, Hoenn is by far the best region. So many memorable places, cities. It was a decently sized region. It was fun to explore. So many things to do, so many things to see, so many things to find. And then you had the music. Generation 3's music is my favorite Pokemon OST of all time. Generation 5 comes close, but Generation 3 is my favorite on that end as well. And arguably the best part of Generation 3, the Pokemon themselves. In my opinion, Generation 3 introduced the most memorable roster of Pokemon, outside of maybe Generation 1 because they were the original 151. But Gen 3's roster is incredible. You had so many memorable Pokemon like Blaziken, Rayquaza, Flygon, Metagross, Glalie, Dusclops, the list goes on. And also the games aged pretty well. Not nearly as archaic as Generation 1, and to some degree Generation 2 is a little archaic, although not nearly as bad as Generation 1. But whenever I replay Generation 3, it doesn't feel old to me. Sure, the graphics aren't as good as the modern games, but it plays very well. It's smooth, it's streamlined, the games are easy to get into, the tutorial's not that long. Sure, Brennan and May aren't exactly the greatest characters of all time, but they're not terrible. They're certainly not X and Y bad. And while Ruby and Sapphire didn't exactly have the greatest post-game, it only really had the Battle Tower and capturing Rayquaza and Sky Pillar, Emerald really stepped it up with the Battle Frontier. Now, personally, I have never played Emerald. It's just a shame because I really want to play it so bad. It looks so amazing. But from what I've seen of the Battle Frontier, it's a real fun time and difficult depending on how you play. And in terms of negatives, honestly, I can't find that many negatives, again, outside of that lackluster post-game in Ruby and Sapphire, and Brendan and May weren't really the best rivals. Generation 3 is just such a treat, and gameplay-wise, even though I think Generation 5 is the best Pokemon generation, and in some cases Generation 4 might be a little better than Generation 3 objectively, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald are incredible Pokemon games, and you have a way to access these games. I highly recommend playing Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Ruby and Sapphire, I put in more hours into them than most other games. Generations 3 and 5 are the only generations that I can play over and over again without getting bored. That's how good they are. And Generation 3 holds a very special place in my heart because it was the first Pokemon game that I knew what I was doing. Because previously as a kid, I didn't beat Generations 1 or 2, but when Gen 3 rolled around, I was dead set on beating it. This will be the first time I will beat a Pokemon game. And when I defeated Steven's Metagross for the first time, which took me a lot of tries as a kid, I was ecstatic. I was jumping all around. I was jumping up and down. I was so excited to finally beat a Pokemon game. And overall, Generation 3 is an incredible Pokemon game. If you can get your hands on these games and play them, I highly recommend you do so. Anyway guys, those are my least favorite to favorite Pokemon generations. Let me know what your personal ranking of the Pokemon generations are. I would love to hear all your opinions and why you think a certain generation is the best or isn't the best or is just meh. And I just want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. I will see you next time. Peace. Have a great day.